Tenzin as a mentor in the Legend of Korra is not the ceaseless, largely flawless fountain of wisdom and thoughtful advice that Iroh is in Avatar: The Last Airbender. That does not necessarily make him a bad mentor, though, and it does not even make him a worse mentor for Korra than Iroh would have been. We see Iroh talk with Korra, and though he, the wise and generous person that he has always been since his personal transformation, even in the spirit world, he helps her out. He gives her advice that revitalizes her spirit and allows her to think about the world from a different vantage point. And yet, his advice does not prove to be as transformative to Korra as Tenzin's is. Tenzin is ultimately the mentor that Korra needs, and he is this precisely because he is flawed, because he is imperfect. He is not who he tries to project himself as. He is not this flawless spiritual leader. He is not this grandiose, magnanimous spiritual guide all draped in golden light and singing with the tune of ancient myths. No. He's a flawed and imperfect person with a difficult upbringing that he does not really want to confront in its fullness. He deeply loves his father. He deeply cares about what his father believed in, and he deeply wants to continue his father's legacy. There is nothing wrong with that. Where he errs is allowing that drive to possess him, to prevent him from thinking critically about his father, for one, and his father's imperfect actions, but also, more importantly, he cannot think critically about his own identity and his own being in the world until he discards the idea of this perfect, idealized connection to the glowing, radiant legacy of his mythologized father, Avatar Aang. The Legend of Korra as a show is about the problem of modernity. Modernity manifests in Korra in terms of, say, industrialization, urbanization. There is a large push toward what we would consider a more modern world, in contrast to what we see in Avatar. And it's quite funny to me that people think that this is unrealistic. Number one, it doesn't matter anyway. But number two, and more interesting to me as a historian, is that it's really not. We think that technology is changing quickly now, and it is, but that is nothing compared to the amount of change that occurred in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Trust me, I'm actually an academic whose research focuses on that period. I think I know it pretty well. To give a brief example, Hong Kong, which I think is a good analog for Republic City, as this place that was founded very quickly and grew exponentially to become a major city of commerce and trade and culture on land that kinda was taken from a different power that has a bit of resentment about that seizure of the land. I'm not saying Hong Kong is literally Republic City, I'm just saying that there are a lot of parallels, and as much as We might think of New York City, for instance, as being a parallel to Republic City in a lot of ways in terms of its position in this East Asian-inspired fantasy world. I would say that Hong Kong is a decent corollary. Hong Kong, in the mid-19th century, goes from not existing at all, more or less, as a city that became a vast city-state, to being this bustling, vibrant, culturally rich and distinct metropolis in about the time that occurs from the end of Avatar to the beginning of Korra, about 70 years. But that's just the external component of modernity. More importantly are the psychological and experiential changes that the modern world brings. It means that an uncomplicated relationship with the past is ultimately impossible. Those old harmonies and those old continuities are broken. Aang can rely on the wisdom of the past, even if he occasionally goes against it. For Korra, the idea of her losing that connection with her past lives is not just an interesting plot point, it is thematically relevant. It is fundamentally about the need to understand the past, understand what came before you, but realize that the past is not this repository of answers. It cannot provide answers to the questions of how to be an avatar in the modern world, or even how to be a leader of any sort in the modern world. Because there's not this one singular answer. How do you resolve conflicts when the problem is not, oh hey, here's this evil megalomaniacal guy trying to take over the world, but oh hey, here are these different groups of people who have critiques of the status quo, and these critiques are, to a certain degree, thoughtful and necessary. How do you incorporate the positive and robust elements from those critiques to not just simply reassert the dominance of old hierarchies and old traditions and old customs in a world where those are not necessarily relevant anymore? And how do you integrate the wisdom of these opposing forces without completely giving in to the complete destruction of any sense of order or stability? It's a hard question. And the avatars of the past don't have answers for that. The world is not like it was back then. That doesn't mean they're idiots in the past. That doesn't mean they weren't trying their best. It just means that ultimately they belong to a different age, and as the avatar of the present, Korra must make decisions for herself and define who and what the avatar is in the modern age for herself. Tenzin is there to help her with that, and he can be an effective helper because he goes through the same struggles as her. Obviously, he's in a much different position than she is. He's in his 50s. He is a notable public figure. He is in many ways very successful in his life, and yet he feels that sense of lack. He feels that he has not been what he really wanted to be, and yet he's not quite sure why. He's still clinging on to this abstraction, this grandiose ideal of the person that he believes he needs to be. And while his intentions might be good, it stops him from being a person of the present. It stops him from being able to eloquently and thoughtfully analyze the conditions and mores of the present and act for the here and now, act based on his actual experience in the world and not all of these abstract, grandiose ideas of who he believes he needs to be. Korra and Tenzin go through the same journey in Season 2, albeit in different ways. While Season 2 has been criticized for a lot of justifiable reasons and also a few reasons I think are a bit silly, one thing it absolutely does right is the relationship between Korra and Tenzin. These two were a bit antagonistic back in Season 1, and though they healed their bond to a certain extent, the underlying issues were not fixed. Tenzin, while he grows a little less absolutist and dogmatic in his treatment of Korra in Season 1, still views himself as this wise and mature spiritual leader whose duty it is to guide Korra toward this absolute, precise goal. Just as Korra believes that there is this one perfect idea of who she should be as the Avatar, that there is such a thing as the Avatar's duty that she needs to figure out, and that someone will tell her what that is. That there are answers waiting somewhere, somehow. If it's not Unalaq, or Tenzin, or her boyfriend, Mako, there must be someone out there who will give her the guidance that she needs. And ultimately, she spends a lot of time alone in Season 2. Not as much, perhaps, as in Season 4 early on, but her psychological isolation is immense. And what Tenzin ultimately has to help her to accept is that there are no grand answers. The great revelation, as Virginia Woolf so beautifully, elegically put it into The Lighthouse, did not come. Perhaps the grand revelation never would come. She, in a messy and fragmented world, needs to decide for herself who the Avatar is to be, just as Tenzin must decide for himself who he is to be. Their stories parallel each other. Tenzin ultimately will never be regarded as the ideal mentor that Iroh is. I don't think a lot of people think about Tenzin as the person they would absolutely trust for advice, the person who can say just the right words to unlock all the mysteries of the psyche and of human experience as a whole. But Tenzin is ultimately a noble figure and a commendable figure. He is one who has this precise idea of who he believes he is, and then he watches that fracture. True, Iroh goes on a similar journey somewhat in the time before Avatar, becoming a much different person from the person we see him being in the flashbacks in episodes like Zuko Alone. But ultimately, Iroh's journey is one of spiritual enlightenment, of becoming disillusioned with the Fire Nation and turning toward a life of peace and spiritual harmony. Tenzin ultimately goes through a process that's somewhat similar, but is more about realizing that there is not and will never be this one fixed idea of who he is to be as the son of Aang, as Korra's mentor, as a spiritual leader. He has to work that out the same way everyone else does, through trial and error, through difficult experience, and trying to allow those experiences to transform and change who he is and what he believes. He has to try to not be rigid. He has to try to respond to those experiences productively and become a wiser and more thoughtful person. That might not be this perfect idea of being a great mentor, but it is one that I hope that we can all respect and perhaps even aspire to. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and do want to see more videos like this. I didn't get a chance to talk about this much, but the theorist Walter Benjamin talks about the idea of the aura, i.e. this pre-modern mystic grandeur that comes from a work of art, or that comes from anything that can't be replicated, that is singular and perfect, and conveys a sort of spiritual grandeur when you're there. Modernity takes that away. Everything becomes diffuse. But the losing of the aura is not necessarily a bad thing, because it opens up a wide variety of other possibilities, and that can be exciting. I think Korra explores that. So tune in soon for our next analysis. We'll be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.